Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif returns to an euphoric welcome after signing an historic nuclear agreement with world powers, but not everyone is happy. Pro-European demonstrations continue in Ukraine. Several people were injured in clashes between riot police and protesters last night in Kiev. And anti-government protesters in Thailand have entered both the finance and the foreign ministries in the country's capital. We'll speak to our Bangkok correspondent. Hello, you're watching France 24, live from Paris. I'm Karen Roberts. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has returned to a euphoric welcome after signing an historic nuclear agreement with world powers in Geneva on Sunday. The 6-month agreement will curb Iran's nuclear activities in return for much-needed sanctions relief. Crowds gathered at the airport carrying flowers and waving flags to greet the negotiating team on their return. Many seeing the deal as a huge triumph for Iran. The French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, had this to say.
Iran has agreed to give up nuclear weapons. It's clear. Regarding civilian nuclear energy, like we've always said, that can advance, but for nuclear weapons, that's a no. The French stance, the President has said before, and I state exactly within these lines, is to see an improvement to the situation for the region and the world.
Well, earlier I spoke to our correspondent Gallagher Fenwick in Jerusalem about another development, the building of 800 new settlement homes. I asked him if Israel was using the Middle East peace process to show its frustration.
Israeli officials are not confirming nor commenting on this revelation, as you mentioned, made by an Israeli NGO concerning the approval by Israel's civil administration of more than 800 new settler homes in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. Chances are, if Israeli officials do make any kinds of comments, they will disassociate as much as possible the Iran deal from the issue of settlement construction. But remember that 2 weeks ago, when the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suspended more than 20,000 tenders which had been issued by his own Minister of Housing for settler homes. He had justified that decision at the time by saying it was counterproductive because he was in the midst of negotiating with the international community over the Iran deal, and it was important at the time not to upset the international community on other issues. Now that this has passed and that Israel has clearly expressed frustration, if not anger, over what was achieved in Geneva, it's true that, well, there probably are less incentives or motivation on Israel's side to want to avoid upsetting the international community on the issue of Jewish colonization.
And Gallagher, what's the Palestinian reaction?
Well, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has said time and again that no matter what happens on the ground, he remains committed to the 9-month time frame for negotiations, which was agreed to with Washington. That being said, his negotiators have tendered their resignation, which he has not yet accepted, precisely over the issue of settlement construction, and has said that Israel is not serious about the peace process and is doing everything it can in order to derail it.
Gallagher Fenwick there in Jerusalem for us. To Ukraine now, where several people were injured in clashes between riot police and protesters taking part in a pro-European Union rally on Sunday night in Kiev. About 100,000 demonstrators rallied to demand that Ukraine's government reverse course and sign a landmark agreement with the European Union in defiance of Russia. And this morning, there were fresh clashes between protesters and police. Joe Tandy reports.
More scuffles with police on Monday morning as demonstrators tried to storm the Prime Minister's building. Urged on by world boxing champion turned politician Vitaly Klitschko, protesters are looking to land a knockout blow on Ukraine's leaders.
We demand the resignation of the government of Prime Minister Azarov because it adopted laws which do not correspond with the interests of the Ukrainian state, which are in breach of legislation on European integration.
A day after Ukraine's biggest march since the 2004 Orange Revolution ushered in a pro-Western government, protesters converged once again on the heart of the capital. Just like 9 years ago, a tent city is in place in Kiev's European Square. Protesters are settling in for the long haul. They vow to stay put until the government backtracks on its decision to scrap a planned trade deal with the European Union.
We came out onto the streets to show them that we're not afraid of them. And if they don't sign the treaty, it will be a catastrophe for the government.
Ministers say the EU agreement would have jeopardized ties with neighboring Russia and threatened Ukrainian jobs. But the movement in favor of the text has the backing of jailed former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. In a letter to demonstrators read by her daughter on Sunday, Tymoshenko said the treaty, if adopted, would be a roadmap to a normal life.
The UN International Special Representative for Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, is to meet US and Russian officials in Geneva. The meeting is to prepare the way for a full Syria peace conference. Diplomats have run into repeated roadblocks over the conference. World powers strongly disagreed on how a future Syrian government should look. Earlier, I spoke to our correspondent, John Zarakostas.
The objective formally announced by the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the date will be 22nd of January 2014. The goal is to have a transitional government made up of opposition political and military units and elements of the Assad regime. But it will not be Mr. Assad ruling anymore. It could be a transitional government as a first step to a new political regime in Syria, a democratic regime in the country where there have been over 120,000 people killed in a 3-year-old civil war. There are still, however, elements that we don't know yet, and perhaps Mr. Brahimi will unveil when he gives a press conference here at the Palais des Nations this afternoon, where the talks have been finalized between the US Undersecretary for Political Affairs, two Russian deputy foreign ministers, and Mr. Ban's Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Mr. Feltman. So for Mr. Ban to make the announcement, that means that the elements have fallen in place. There have been delays, and this conference has been pushed back month after month because of concerns that the elements were not ready yet for a conference to be held, which could have ended up in failure. The objective is to have government and opposition forces coming here and brokering a peace deal.
John Zarakostas there in Geneva. In Libya, the army is on a state of alert in the eastern city of Benghazi. At least 9 people have been killed and 49 wounded in clashes with fighters from Ansar al-Sharia, Libya's main jihadist group. Several sources claim that a radio station and a hospital have also been torched. To Mali now, where Sunday's parliamentary elections have been marred by poor voter turnout and minor unrest. Over 1,000 candidates are competing for 147 seats in parliament. These elections mark the country's efforts to return to stability after a military coup last March and the French military intervention that followed. This report from Delano de Souza.
Polling stations across Mali shut their doors and began the count. But the long lines witnessed during the presidential elections in August were nowhere to be found.
Compared to the presidential elections, voter turnout was low. We didn't even make it to 100 voters by the end of the day, out of the 481 people who registered.
The President's Rally for Mali party is widely expected to win the elections. In August, Ibrahim Boubacar Keita won the presidential elections by a landslide. He hopes a fully functioning parliament will help get Mali back on its feet.
Let's hope our country goes back to its friendliness of old, its harmony, and that a reunited Mali dedicates itself to its sovereign mission of development for the happiness of the Malian people.
Voting was also held in Timbuktu in the north of the country, the site of the French-led military intervention earlier this year. The security situation in the north has begun to deteriorate in recent months.
Being here, I think the vote is going well. The security rules are being followed, and we can only encourage those that have put this system in place, and I hope that the best man wins.
A second round of polls will be held on December 15th in constituencies where there is no majority winner.
To Thailand now, where thousands of anti-government protesters have entered the Finance Ministry compound in the country's capital in a campaign to topple the government of Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. Protesters say they want Yingluck to step down amid claims that her government is controlled by ousted leader Thaksin Shinawatra, that's her brother. Today's rally came a day after about 100,000 people marched in Bangkok. It's the largest rally Thailand has seen in years. Well, for more, let's now cross live to Ishmael Wolf, that's our correspondent in Bangkok. Well, earlier the protesters entered the Ministry of Finance. They have now entered the Foreign Ministry. What's the current situation?
That's correct. The protests that began yesterday in earnest, really, spilled into today, and as you say, they entered the Finance Ministry. They split into about a dozen different groups today, heading to different areas across the city. They've targeted 5 television stations in the city where they are trying to impel upon the TV stations to cover the protests in the way that they want them to be covered. And as you say, just an hour or two ago, the Foreign Ministry became a new focus of these protests, and they've broken through the security at the compound there. From what we've seen, what I've seen around there, I mean, they're well organised, there's water and food, and as we've seen in the past, these protest groups are very willing to stay for a long time once they find their way into one of these compounds. In 2008, a similar protest group with the same aims, it seems, called the Yellow Shirts, they took over the government house for several weeks, and as well also took over the main airport. So at the moment it seems that they're sitting for the long haul, but as you say, they're calling for the dissolution of the government now, and we wait to see what happens from here.
Well, can the protesters really achieve this?
Yes, indeed. This is the question that everyone's looking at the moment. We've seen in the past this intractable political dispute that's taken place. And what they're asking for is the toppling of the current government. And they also say that they want political reform. They say that successive governments over the past 10 years have been ruled and controlled by Thaksin Shinawatra, a former businessman turned successful politician. And what we're really looking at here is that even if the Prime Minister decides to call new elections or stand down, it's hard to see how the previous election results that we've seen over the last 11 years that have all gone in favour in different levels. Either, in the last election in 2011, it was 53% in support of the current government and 32% in support of the Democrat Party, which is leading the protests at the moment. So it's difficult to see whether they'll be able to achieve their aims in the short term or even in the long term at the moment.
OK, Ishmael Wolf in Bangkok, thank you very much for that update. Now for something completely different. It's a modern-day Romeo and Juliet story that's captured the imagination of Yemenis and Saudis alike. A young Saudi woman is fighting in a Yemeni court for the right to stay with her beloved. Against her family's wishes, the daring 22-year-old eloped with her 25-year-old Yemeni beau. Now, Yemeni authorities are deciding whether to send her back home, where supporters say her life is at risk. Siobhan Silk has this report.
Love is beyond borders, says this banner carried by some of the hundreds of protesters outside a Yemen courtroom. They gathered in support of a young Saudi woman who defied her family to elope with her Yemeni boyfriend. 22-year-old Huda Al-Niran crossed the border to join Arafat Tahar. There, authorities arrested her for entering the country illegally.
We came here to peacefully support Huda and her rights to humanitarian asylum. We oppose her deportation to Saudi Arabia as her life will be at risk.
Saudi women are forbidden from leaving their country without the permission of a male relative. Huda's lawyer said Saudi authorities were pressuring Yemen to deport her. But human rights organisations say she could be at risk of family violence if she's sent back to Saudi Arabia. She has petitioned the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for support.
As long as the UNHCR considers Huda as a refugee, the judge is forced to abide by the decree and pass a verdict for her to be granted asylum.
The court has postponed proceedings as it awaits the UNHCR response. The Star-Crossed lovers won't know their fate until the 1st of December.
That's it for now. More news coming up. Do stay with us here on France 24.